The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 7, casting long shadows across the worn wooden benches. James Wilson adjusted his tie nervously as he waited for his case to be called. At 73 years old, the retired Army sergeant hadn't expected to spend his Tuesday in court, especially over something as trivial as a property line dispute with the shopping center being built next to his home of 40 years. The courthouse buzzed with activity, but James sat quietly, occasionally nodding to acknowledge the few familiar faces he recognized. His weathered hands, spotted with age and marked by years of hard work, rested on a manila folder containing property surveys dating back to 1978. He'd brought his hearing aids, but the batteries were running low, making the courtroom sounds blend together in a confusing jumble. Case number 47B, Wilson versus Riverside Development, called the bailiff, his voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. James rose slowly, his left knee stiff from an old injury that still bothered him when the weather changed. He gathered his documents and made his way to the plaintiff's table, moving with the careful dignity of a man who had seen much in his lifetime. The walk seemed longer than it should have been, and he could feel eyes following him as he limped slightly down the center aisle. Judge Robert Harmon watched from his bench with thinly veiled impatience. At 52, Harmon had earned a reputation for running an efficient courtroom, sometimes at the expense of compassion. Today he was already running behind schedule, with a docket full of cases and a charity golf tournament penciled in for the afternoon. "Mr. Wilson, are you represented by counsel today?" Judge Harmon asked, glancing at the empty chair beside the elderly man. James didn't respond immediately, struggling to hear the question through the background noise. He leaned forward slightly, eyes squinting in concentration. "Mr. Wilson," Judge Harmon repeated, louder this time, his irritation becoming evident. "I asked if you have an attorney present." "I'm sorry, Your Honor," James finally replied, his voice deep but gentle. "I don't hear so well these days." "No, sir, I'm representing myself. Couldn't afford a lawyer for something that should be straightforward." The judge frowned, making a note on the pad before him. Across the aisle, the development company's table was crowded with 3 attorneys in expensive suits, all looking remarkably similar with their slick haircuts and confident smiles. "Let's proceed then," Judge Harmon said. "The complaint alleges that Riverside Development has encroached on your property line by approximately 8 feet during their recent construction. Is that correct?" James nodded, then remembered to speak aloud. "Yes, Your Honor. I've got the original property survey right here. And..." "Please approach and present your evidence," the judge interrupted. James gathered his papers and moved toward the bench, unaware that some documents had slipped from his folder and fallen to the floor behind him. One of the development's lawyers smirked, making no move to point out the missing papers. "Your Honor," began the lead attorney for Riverside, standing smoothly. "We've already filed our survey conducted last month, which clearly shows we're within our legal boundaries. Mr. Wilson's survey is over 40 years old and doesn't account for the official rezoning that occurred in 1992. James turned, confused. "Rezoning? I never received any notice about rezoning. I've lived there since '81, right after I came home from my last tour." "Tour?" Judge Harmon asked, momentarily distracted. "Vietnam, sir. 3 tours. 1967 through 75 with the 173rd Airborne Brigade." The judge nodded curtly, unimpressed by the information. "The rezoning issue is irrelevant to today's proceedings if it was properly filed at the time. We're here to determine the current legal boundary." "But they're tearing up my garden, sir," James insisted, his voice rising slightly with emotion. "The garden where I grow vegetables for the community kitchen. Been doing it for 20 years now. Mr. Wilson, please stick to the legal matter at hand," Judge Harmon said sharply. James tried to explain further, but a court officer approached the judge and whispered something, causing Harmon to check his watch with an annoyed expression. "We need to move this along," the judge announced. "Mr. Wilson, do you have any evidence more recent than 1978? James couldn't quite hear the question. "I'm sorry? Do you have any recent surveys?" Judge Harmon repeated, enunciating with obvious frustration. "I had someone come out last month, but they wanted $600 for an official document. And my pension doesn't stretch that far," James explained. The judge sighed heavily. "So you have no current documentation to dispute the developer's survey?" James reached into his pocket for his reading glasses, fumbling slightly. I have photographs showing where their bulldozer knocked down my fence. If I could just— Mr. Wilson, Judge Harmon cut in sharply. I've asked you a direct question. Do you have a current legal survey document? Again, James struggled to hear clearly. He looked confused, trying to piece together what the judge was asking. Your Honor, Answer the question, Mr. Wilson. If you'd just give me a moment to explain. Judge Harmon's patience finally snapped. Mr. Wilson, I find your continued evasiveness disrespectful to this court. I'm holding you in contempt. A murmur ran through the courtroom. James stood frozen, genuinely bewildered by the sudden turn of events. Your Honor, I don't understand, he said quietly. I'm just trying to save my garden. Bailiff, take Mr. Wilson into custody, Judge Harmon ordered, already gathering papers for the next case. 3 days in county jail might teach you to respect court procedures. The bailiff approached, looking uncomfortable but determined to do his job. Sir, I need you to come with me. James stood rooted to the spot, disbelief etched across his face. Jail? For trying to protect my property? Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. A young law clerk at the side of the courtroom looked openly distressed, scribbling something frantically on a notepad. Your Honor, if I could just have a moment to explain my hearing difficulty. James tried one last time. Remove him, Judge Harmon commanded, turning his attention to his computer screen, effectively dismissing the elderly veteran. The bailiff gently took James by the arm. I'm sorry, sir, but I have to follow orders. James allowed himself to be led away, his shoulders slumped but his head held high. As he passed the gallery, a young woman with concerned eyes rose slightly as if wanting to object, but remained silent under the judge's stern gaze. In the holding area behind the courtroom, reality began to sink in for James. The bailiff, a younger man with kind eyes, looked genuinely troubled as he processed the paperwork. I've never been to jail before, James said quietly, not even when I was young and foolish. The bailiff nodded sympathetically. The judge has been under a lot of pressure lately with the election coming up. He's trying to look tough on all fronts. Tough? James repeated, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. Sending an old man to jail over a garden seems more like bullying than toughness. As the bailiff collected James's personal belongings, his wallet with faded photos of his late wife and children, a set of keys and a worn military challenge coin he always carried, he noticed a Veterans Affairs medical card. You really did serve in Vietnam? The bailiff asked. James nodded. 173rd Airborne. Lost a lot of good friends over there. The bailiff hesitated, then continued his work. My father was in Vietnam too. Different unit, though. It was a long time ago, James said, his mind clearly elsewhere. Never thought I'd end up in handcuffs after all these years. And for what? Trying to save a garden that feeds people who can't afford fresh vegetables. In the courthouse office, the young law clerk who had witnessed the exchange burst through the door, startling the administrative staff. Tina, I need to see the file on the Wilson case immediately, she said urgently. Melissa, you know you can't interfere with the judge's rulings, Tina replied. But her expression showed concern. I'm not interfering. I'm investigating, Melissa insisted. That man is a disabled veteran who couldn't hear the judge's questions properly. This is a travesty. Reluctantly, Tina handed over the file. Melissa flipped through it quickly, her eyes widening as she read. James Wilson, 3 Purple Hearts, Bronze Star with Valor, she muttered. And he's being sent to county lockup for contempt? Meanwhile, across town, James sat on a hard bench in a holding cell staring at the gray wall opposite him. His thoughts drifted to another time when he'd been confined in a small space, a memory he'd spent decades trying to forget. The sounds of the jail, metal doors clanging and distant voices echoing, transported him back to darker days. A corrections officer appeared at the cell door. Wilson, James E., you'll be transferred to county in about an hour. Standard 3-day contempt hold. James nodded silently, his dignity intact despite the circumstances. As the officer turned to leave, James spoke. Officer, is there any way to get a message to my daughter? She's expecting me for dinner tonight, and she'll worry if I don't show up. The officer paused. You get 1 phone call when we process you at county. Best save it for then. Left alone again, James closed his eyes, thinking of his daughter and how upset she would be, not just about his absence, but about the injustice of the situation. Catherine had always been a fighter, just like her father, but with a law degree to back up her convictions. She wouldn't let this stand. As he sat waiting, James had no way of knowing that Melissa, the law clerk, had already found Catherine's contact information in his file. And he certainly couldn't have imagined that within hours, his former commanding officer, now a 4-star general with considerable influence, would be boarding a plane, determined to right this wrong. In his chambers, Judge Harmon was already forgetting about the elderly veteran as he prepared for his next case, unaware that his hasty decision would soon return to haunt him in ways he could never have anticipated. Catherine Wilson rushed through the doors of the county courthouse, her heart pounding in her chest. She hadn't heard from her father in hours, which was unusual for a man who called her every evening without fail. When she tried calling his home, there was no answer. Something was wrong. "I'm looking for information about James Wilson," she told the clerk at the information desk, trying to keep her voice steady. "He had a hearing today about a property dispute." The clerk typed the name into her computer, then frowned slightly. "It looks like that case was heard in courtroom 7 this morning. Judge Harmon presiding, and," Catherine pressed, leaning forward. The clerk hesitated. "I'm sorry, but it appears Mr. Wilson was held in contempt of court and sentenced to 3 days in county jail." Catherine's hand flew to her mouth. "Jail, my father? There must be some mistake. He's 73 years old with a heart condition." As Catherine struggled to process this information, a young woman approached from a nearby office. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I'm Melissa Chen, a law clerk here. I was in Judge Harmon's courtroom during your father's hearing. Could we talk privately for a moment?" Catherine nodded, following Melissa to a small conference room off the main hallway. Once the door closed behind them, Melissa's professional demeanor softened. "What happened to my father?" Catherine asked, her voice breaking slightly. "An injustice," Melissa said simply. "Judge Harmon became frustrated when your father couldn't hear his questions properly. Instead of accommodating his disability, the judge interpreted it as disrespect and ordered him to jail for contempt." Catherine sank into a chair, stunned. "My father has severe hearing loss from his military service. He wears hearing aids, but they don't always work well in noisy environments." "I suspected something like that," Melissa said, opening a folder she'd brought with her. "I took the liberty of pulling your father's case file after what happened. That's when I found his military records." She paused, looking at Catherine with newfound respect. "Did you know the extent of your father's service?" Catherine smiled sadly. "Dad never talks about Vietnam." "Whatever happened there, he kept it locked inside. Well, according to his file, Sergeant James Wilson received 3 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star with valor. He saved the lives of numerous soldiers during an ambush in 1968. Melissa pushed the file toward Catherine. "And there's something else you should see." Catherine leaned forward to look at the page Melissa was pointing to. There, in faded type, was a commendation letter signed by Lieutenant Thomas Bradley, praising her father's extraordinary courage under fire and selfless dedication to his fellow soldiers. "Lieutenant Bradley?" Catherine read aloud. "Why does that name sound familiar?" "Because he's now General Thomas Bradley," Melissa explained. 4-star general and vice chief of staff of the Army. Catherine's eyes widened. "My father mentioned someone named Tom who visited once when I was very young. I barely remember it." "Your father saved his life according to this report," Melissa said, "along with 16 others." Catherine stared at the documents, seeing her quiet, humble father in a new light. All these years he'd never mentioned the extent of his heroism, never used his service for recognition or special treatment. "I need to get him out of there," Catherine said firmly, standing up. "He shouldn't spend a single night in jail over a misunderstanding." "I agree," Melissa nodded. "Judge Harmon overreacted, but he's unlikely to reverse his decision without significant pressure. He has a reputation for being stubborn." Catherine paced the small room, thinking, "Then we'll create pressure. I'm an attorney myself, though I practice corporate law, but I know enough to file an emergency petition citing my father's medical conditions." She paused, looking back at the file. "And I think I need to make a phone call to someone who might remember my father very well." Melissa handed Catherine a slip of paper. "I thought you might say that. It took some doing, but I found contact information for General Bradley's office at the Pentagon." Catherine took the paper, her hand trembling slightly. "Thank you. I don't know why you're helping us, but I'm grateful." Melissa smiled. "My grandfather was in Vietnam too. He came back different, according to my mom. Whatever happened to those men over there? They deserve better than what your father got today. While Catherine made her calls, James Wilson sat alone in a holding cell at the county jail. The noise was overwhelming. Clanging doors, shouting inmates, guards calling out orders. For a man who lived alone in a quiet house surrounded by his garden, the sensory overload was exhausting. "Wilson," a guard called out. "You've got processing next, then medical check." James stood up slowly, his joints stiff from sitting on the hard bench. "Thank you, officer." The guard looked at him curiously. "You're certainly politer than most of our guests. What are you in for, anyway?" "Contempt of court," James replied. "Couldn't hear the judge's questions properly." The guard shook his head. "Harmon, right? Man sent more seniors to lock up than any judge in the county. Likes to make examples of people." As James followed the guard down a long corridor, he thought about Catherine. She'd be worried sick by now. His one phone call had gone straight to her voicemail. She was probably in court herself, unable to answer. At the Pentagon, General Thomas Bradley was reviewing deployment strategies when his aide entered with an unusual message. "Sir, there's a call on line 2 that you might want to take," the aide said carefully. "A Catherine Wilson, daughter of Sergeant James Wilson, Vietnam, 173rd Airborne." Bradley looked up sharply, memories flooding back from decades ago. "Wilson, Jimmy Wilson?" "Yes, sir. She says it's urgent." Bradley immediately picked up the phone. "This is General Bradley." "General, my name is Catherine Wilson. James Wilson is my father," she began, her voice clear and determined. "I apologize for contacting you this way, but my father is in trouble, and from what I've just learned, you might be one of the few people who would care." As Catherine explained the situation, Bradley's expression darkened. His aide, watching from across the room, hadn't seen the general look this angry in years. "Your father saved my life, Ms. Wilson," Bradley said when she finished, "and the lives of 16 other men who all went on to have families and careers because of his courage. He's the reason I'm sitting in this office today." There was a pause. "Text me the details of which jail he's in. I'll be on the next flight." In his chambers, Judge Robert Harmon was reviewing case notes when his clerk knocked tentatively on the door. "What is it, Paul?" Harmon asked without looking up. "Sir, there's been a development regarding the Wilson contempt case from this morning." "Wilson?" Harmon frowned, trying to place the name among the dozens of cases he'd heard that day. "The property line dispute?" "Yes, sir. The elderly gentleman you sent to county for 3 days." "Ah, right. The one who kept ignoring my questions?" Harmon waved dismissively. "What about him?" "His daughter has filed an emergency petition for his release, citing medical necessity. She's included documentation of his service-connected hearing disability and heart condition." Harmon scoffed. "Everyone has a medical condition when they're facing consequences." "Deny it." The clerk shifted uncomfortably. "There's more, sir. She's also filed a formal complaint with the Judicial Conduct Board, alleging failure to provide reasonable accommodation for a disabled veteran." That got Harmon's attention. "On what grounds?" "The Americans with Disabilities Act, sir. Apparently, Mr. Wilson has documented hearing loss from his military service. She's arguing that his inability to hear your questions was misinterpreted as contempt." Harmon leaned back in his chair, considering. "Is she an attorney?" "Yes, sir. Corporate law with Dawson and Reeves." "Great," Harmon muttered. "Just what I need before the Judicial Review Committee meets next month." He sighed heavily. "Fine. Prepare an order for Wilson's release, but make it clear that I'm doing so out of compassion for his age and condition, not because I was wrong." The clerk hesitated again. "There's one more thing, sir. The Pentagon called." "The Pentagon," Harmon repeated, certain he'd misheard. "Why would the Pentagon care about a local contempt case?" "Apparently, sir, Mr. Wilson is a highly decorated combat veteran. He served with distinction in Vietnam and saved the life of a man who is now General Thomas Bradley, Vice Chief of Staff of the Army." Harmon felt a cold sensation spreading through his chest. And General Bradley is on his way here. His office called to inform us that he'll be arriving tomorrow morning and has requested a meeting with you regarding Mr. Wilson's case." The color drained from Harmon's face. A 4-star general was flying in specifically to discuss how he'd treated a veteran. This could become a public relations nightmare. "Get Wilson released immediately," he ordered. "And clear my morning calendar tomorrow." As the clerk hurried away, Harmon sat back in his chair, suddenly feeling very small. He'd built his reputation on being tough, on running an efficient courtroom where people respected his authority. But had he crossed a line this time? He pulled up the county records database and searched for James Wilson. The file that appeared on his screen told a story very different from the confused old man he'd dismissed that morning. 3 Purple Hearts. Bronze Star with Valor. Multiple commendations for bravery under fire. For the first time in years, Judge Robert Harmon felt something he rarely experienced on the bench: doubt. Meanwhile, at the county jail, James Wilson was trying to rest on the thin mattress of his cell when a guard appeared at the door. "Wilson, grab your things. You're being released." James looked up in confusion. "Released? I thought I had 3 days." "Judge changed his mind," the guard said, unlocking the cell. "Someone important must have made a call. This kind of thing doesn't happen often." As James gathered his few belongings, he wondered what Catherine had done. His daughter was a force of nature when she set her mind to something, just like her mother had been. What James didn't know was that the storm was just beginning. By this time tomorrow, Judge Harmon would come face to face not just with a 4-star general, but with the consequences of his own hasty judgment. The next morning dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside the county courthouse. Staff arrived earlier than usual, an electric tension hanging in the air. Word had spread quickly. A 4-star general was coming, and he wasn't happy. Judge Robert Harmon sat in his chambers, adjusting his tie for the 3rd time. He'd spent a sleepless night reviewing James Wilson's file, each commendation and medal making him more uneasy about his hasty decision. Now he waited for a meeting that could potentially derail his career. "Judge Harmon?" His assistant poked her head through the door. "They're here." Harmon stood up, smoothing his robes. "Send them in." He expected pomp and circumstance, a uniformed entourage befitting a high-ranking military official. Instead, when the door opened, a single man entered. General Thomas Bradley wore his full-dress uniform, 4 stars gleaming on each shoulder, his chest adorned with rows of colorful medals and ribbons. He was tall, straight-backed, despite being in his 70s, with a face that had weathered both war and Washington politics. "General Bradley," Harmon said, extending his hand. "It's an honor to meet you." Bradley looked at the offered hand but didn't take it. "I wish I could say the same, Judge Harmon." The judge let his hand fall awkwardly to his side. "Please, have a seat. I understand you're here about James Wilson." "James Wilson," Bradley repeated, his voice measured as he sat down. "Sergeant James Wilson. 3 Purple Hearts. Bronze Star with Valor. A man who crawled through enemy fire to drag 17 wounded men to safety, including me." He fixed Harmon with a steady gaze. "A man who spent yesterday afternoon in a jail cell because he couldn't hear you clearly." Harmon cleared his throat. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding. Once I learned of Mr. Wilson's condition, I immediately ordered his release." "A misunderstanding." Bradley's voice remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "Let me make sure I understand correctly. A 73-year-old man with documented hearing loss from combat service was jailed for contempt because he couldn't hear your questions. Is that an accurate summary?" "It's more complicated than that," Harmon began. "Actually, it's very simple," Bradley interrupted. "The Americans with Disabilities Act requires reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities in all public facilities, including courtrooms." "Did you ask Mr. Wilson if he needed accommodation for his hearing loss?" "He didn't mention. Did you notice his hearing aids? Did you consider that an elderly man who wasn't responding to questions might have a hearing problem rather than being deliberately disrespectful?" Harmon had no answer. In truth, he hadn't considered any of those things. He'd been focused on his schedule, on maintaining control of his courtroom, on getting to that charity golf tournament. "I've brought some people with me," Bradley continued, standing up. "They're waiting in the conference room. I think you should hear what they have to say." Harmon followed Bradley down the hallway, acutely aware of the stares from courthouse staff. The conference room door opened to reveal a small group seated around the large table. Catherine Wilson sat beside her father, who looked tired but dignified in a pressed shirt and tie. Beside them sat an older woman Harmon didn't recognize, along with a middle-aged man in a suit and a younger woman taking notes. "Judge Harmon," Bradley said formally, "you've met Sergeant Wilson. This is his daughter, Catherine, an attorney with Dawson and Reeves. Next to her is Dr. Diane Powell, Chief of Audiology at the VA Medical Center, and Richard Torres from the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division." Harmon felt the blood drain from his face. The DOJ was involved now? Please sit down, Judge, Bradley said, gesturing to an empty chair. Harmon sat, feeling distinctly like he was now the one on trial. Mr. Torres. Bradley nodded to the DOJ representative. Torres opened a folder. Judge Harmon, we're here to discuss what appears to be a pattern of behavior in your courtroom. Sergeant Wilson's case caught our attention, but upon investigation, we've found 7 similar incidents in the past year alone. Elderly defendants, many of them minorities, held in contempt for what was described as failure to properly respond to direct questions. I treat everyone in my courtroom the same, Harmon protested. That's precisely the problem, Dr. Powell interjected gently. People with disabilities don't need the same treatment. They need appropriate accommodations. Sergeant Wilson has 70% hearing loss in his right ear and 55% in his left, a direct result of his exposure to artillery fire in Vietnam. James Wilson sat quietly through this exchange, his eyes fixed on Judge Harmon. There was no anger in his gaze, just a deep, penetrating look that made Harmon more uncomfortable than any shouting could have. Your Honor, Catherine spoke up, her voice professional but with an undercurrent of controlled anger. My father spent 36 hours in county jail. At his age, with his medical conditions that posed a serious health risk, he missed 2 doses of his heart medication. He was subjected to noise levels that caused him physical pain due to his hearing condition, and all because he couldn't hear questions in a crowded courtroom. Harmon looked down at the table. I've already acknowledged the error and ordered his release. After I filed a formal complaint, Catherine countered. And after learning that General Bradley was involved. What exactly do you want from me? Harmon asked, looking from face to face. It was James Wilson who finally broke his silence. I don't want anything from you, Judge. His deep voice was soft but carried clearly across the table. I've lived long enough to know that holding on to anger only hurts yourself. But there are others who might find themselves in your courtroom. Veterans, elderly folks, people with disabilities who can't speak up for themselves like I couldn't. General Bradley nodded. That's why we're here, Judge Harmon. Not for vengeance, but for change. Torres slid a document across the table. This is a proposed consent agreement. The Justice Department is prepared to forgo a formal investigation if you agree to implement a comprehensive ADA compliance program in your courtroom, including staff training and appropriate accommodations. Harmon scanned the document, relief washing over him. This was far better than the career-ending scandal he'd feared. I'll need to consult with the county attorney, but this seems reasonable. There's one more thing, Bradley said. A personal apology to Sergeant Wilson. Not behind closed doors, but in open court. Harmon looked up sharply. In open court? The same place where you humiliated him, Bradley confirmed. That's non-negotiable. Catherine watched the judge carefully. My father deserves to have his dignity restored in the same place it was taken from him. Harmon turned to James, really looking at him for the first time. Beyond the age, beyond the hearing aids, he saw something he'd missed before. The quiet strength, the straight shoulders, the eyes that had seen horrors Harmon couldn't imagine. Mr. Wilson, he said quietly, I would be willing to offer that apology right now. James shook his head slowly. Not for me, Judge, for the record, so that anyone who heard about what happened knows that justice works both ways. For judges and for regular folks, too. Outside the conference room, courthouse staff went about their business, unaware of the profound conversation taking place behind the closed door. Melissa Chen, the law clerk who had first reached out to Catherine, waited anxiously in her office, hoping her small act of courage had helped set things right. Back in the conference room, Harmon was signing the agreement, his hand slightly unsteady. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of the power he wielded from the bench, and the responsibility that came with it. We've scheduled a special session for tomorrow morning, Bradley informed him, taking the signed document. The press has already caught wind of the story, but how it ends is up to you, Judge. I understand, Harmon said, standing up. He turned to James Wilson. Mr. Wilson, Sergeant Wilson, I hope you can accept my sincere apology for what happened. I failed to see you as a person, and that was wrong. James rose slowly, using his cane for support. He extended his hand to the judge. Tomorrow, in court, we start fresh. That's all I ask. Harmon shook the offered hand, noticing the strength still present in the elderly man's grip. As the meeting concluded and people began filing out, General Bradley hung back with James. When they were alone, the two old soldiers looked at each other, decades falling away. "It's been a long time, Jimmy," Bradley said, his formal demeanor softening. "Too long, Tom," James replied with a small smile. "Wish it had been under better circumstances." "You look good," James laughed. "I look old. We both do." Bradley put a hand on his friend's shoulder. "You know, I've never forgotten what you did that day. None of us have. The men you saved. We get together every few years. Always drink a toast to you." James looked down. "I was just doing my job." "No," Bradley said firmly. "You went above and beyond. Then and now." He paused. "I read about your community garden, feeding people who need help. Still saving people, aren't you?" James shrugged. "Just trying to be useful." As they walked slowly out of the courthouse together, the general and the sergeant, Bradley asked, "Will you come to the next reunion? The guys would love to see you." James thought about it, then nodded. "I'd like that. Been too long hiding from the past." Outside, Catherine waited by her car. She watched her father walking beside the four-star general, two elderly men who had once been young soldiers together in a faraway jungle. Despite their different paths in life, one to the highest ranks of military command, the other to a quiet life with a garden, they shared a bond that transcended time and circumstance. Tomorrow would bring the public apology, the official righting of a wrong. But today, in this moment, something more important had already been restored. Connections thought lost to time, and the dignity of a man who had never asked for recognition, only respect. By the next morning, word had spread through the small city. The courthouse steps were crowded with people, veterans in service caps, community members, and reporters with cameras and microphones. A local TV van was parked across the street, a reporter doing a live stand-up for the morning news. We're outside the county courthouse where, in an unusual turn of events, Judge Robert Harmon is expected to issue a public apology to 73-year-old Vietnam veteran James Wilson, who was jailed for contempt of court earlier this week. Sources tell us that a high-ranking military official intervened personally in the case. Inside, courtroom 7 was filled beyond capacity. The bailiff had given up trying to maintain perfect order as people squeezed into every available space. In the front row sat Catherine Wilson beside her father, who was dressed in a navy blue suit that hung slightly loose on his frame. Next to them sat General Bradley in full dress uniform, a visual reminder of the authority behind this unusual proceeding. James looked around, uncomfortable with being the center of attention. "All this fuss," he muttered to his daughter. "Seems unnecessary." "It's not just for you, Dad," Catherine replied quietly. "It's for every person who's been treated unfairly in a courtroom and never got justice." At exactly 9 a.m., the bailiff called for attention. "All rise. The Court of Common Pleas is now in session, the Honorable Judge Robert Harmon presiding." Judge Harmon entered, his face solemn. He took his seat at the bench and surveyed the packed courtroom before speaking. "Please be seated," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the sound system, a system that had been specially checked and adjusted the previous evening. "Before we begin today's regular docket, there is a special matter I wish to address." The courtroom fell silent. Reporters leaned forward, pens poised above notepads. "Would Sergeant James Wilson please stand?" Harmon requested. James looked momentarily startled, then slowly rose to his feet, leaning slightly on his cane. The judge adjusted his microphone and spoke directly to him. "Sergeant Wilson, 2 days ago, you appeared in my courtroom regarding a property dispute. During that proceeding, I misinterpreted your difficulty hearing my questions as disrespect for the court. As a result, I held you in contempt and ordered you to spend 3 days in the county jail." Harmon paused, visibly struggling with what came next. In 20 years on the bench, he had rarely admitted error. "I was wrong," he continued, his voice steady despite his discomfort. "I failed to recognize or accommodate your hearing disability, which you sustained while serving our country with honor and distinction. In doing so, I not only violated court policy on providing reasonable accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but I also failed in my fundamental duty as a judge, to ensure that every person who appears in this courtroom is treated with dignity and respect. A murmur ran through the crowd. Catherine reached over and squeezed her father's hand. Sergeant Wilson, on behalf of this court, I offer you my sincere and unreserved apology. The contempt order has been vacated and expunged from all records. It will not appear in any court file or public record. James nodded once, accepting the apology with quiet dignity. But Judge Harmon wasn't finished. I would also like to announce that, effective immediately, this court is implementing comprehensive changes to ensure that all individuals with disabilities receive appropriate accommodations. He lifted a document. This consent agreement, developed in consultation with the Department of Justice, includes mandatory training for all court personnel, improved signage, and information about available accommodations, and a new position of ADA compliance coordinator to oversee these efforts. The judge set down the paper and looked directly at James again. Sergeant Wilson, would you like to address the court? James looked surprised. He hadn't expected to be given a voice. He glanced at General Bradley, who gave him an encouraging nod. Slowly, James made his way to the center of the courtroom. A court officer adjusted the microphone to his height. Thank you, Your Honor, James began, his deep voice soft but clear. I accept your apology. We all make mistakes. What matters is how we fix them. He paused, gathering his thoughts. The courtroom remained utterly silent. I'm not much for speeches, never have been. But I'd like to say something about respect. When I was in Vietnam, we had to respect each other to survive. Didn't matter what color you were, where you came from, or how much money your family had. What mattered was that we looked out for each other. James looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with several veterans who nodded in understanding. I've been back home for 50 years now. Worked hard, raised a family, tried to be a good neighbor, grew vegetables in my garden and shared them with folks who needed fresh food. Never asked for special treatment because of what I did over there. But I did expect to be treated with the same respect I give others. He turned slightly to face Judge Harmon directly. Your Honor, what happened to me could happen to anyone. An elderly person who can't hear well, someone who doesn't speak English perfectly, a young person with a disability that isn't visible. We all deserve the chance to be heard, really heard, especially in a place where decisions are made that affect our lives. Many in the courtroom nodded, some wiping away tears. Catherine watched her father with pride shining in her eyes. So I accept your apology, and I appreciate the changes you're making. They'll make a difference for a lot of folks who might stand where I'm standing someday. Thank you. With that, James returned to his seat, the quiet shuffle of his steps the only sound in the otherwise silent courtroom. Judge Harmon cleared his throat. Thank you, Sergeant Wilson. Your words will be taken to heart. He looked out at the packed courtroom. We will now proceed with the regular docket, but first we'll take a 15-minute recess. As the judge left the bench, the courtroom erupted in conversation. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. Veterans approached James to shake his hand or simply pat him on the shoulder in silent solidarity. General Bradley watched with satisfaction as a circle of well-wishers formed around his old friend. A reporter approached him. General Bradley, was this outcome what you hoped for when you flew in yesterday? Bradley considered the question carefully. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about recognition, acknowledging a wrong and making sure it doesn't happen again. Today I think we saw real justice. Outside the courthouse, a group of elderly veterans had gathered, many wearing service caps identifying their military units. When James emerged into the sunshine, they straightened to attention and saluted him. James stopped, visibly moved by the gesture. Slowly, he returned their salute. A young man approached, holding out a hand. Sir, my grandfather served in the 173rd. He didn't make it back. I just wanted to say thank you for what you did over there and what you did in there today. James shook the offered hand. What's your name, son? David Thompson. What was your grandfather's name? Michael Thompson. He was a radio operator. James's eyes widened slightly. Mikey T. I knew your grandfather. He was a good man, brave, always had a joke, even when things were bad. David stared at James in disbelief. You knew him? Really knew him? Sure did. He had a picture of your grandmother in his helmet, pretty lady with a yellow ribbon in her hair. David's eyes filled with tears. That's her. That's my Grandma Rose. He turned to call to an elderly woman waiting nearby. Grandma. He knew Grandpa Mike. Rose Thompson approached slowly, leaning on a walker. When she reached them, she looked up at James with eyes that had seen decades of joy and sorrow. You knew my Michael? She asked softly. James nodded. Yes, ma'am. He talked about you all the time. Carried your picture everywhere. Rose reached out a trembling hand to touch James's arm. Thank you for remembering him. It means so much. As James spoke with Rose and David, Catherine stood nearby with General Bradley watching the unexpected reunion. Did you know this would happen? She asked him. Bradley shook his head. No, but I'm not surprised. Your father was the kind of soldier everyone remembered. Not because he was loud or sought attention, but because he was rock solid. The kind of man you wanted beside you when things got tough. He's always been that way, Catherine said. Even when life was hard, when Mom got sick, when money was tight, he never complained, just kept going, kept helping others. Some men are built that way, Bradley observed. They carry their strength quietly. Across the courthouse steps, Judge Harmon watched the scene from a distance. He'd removed his judicial robe and stood in a simple suit, observing the veteran being embraced by his community. Something shifted inside him, a recognition that the authority of his position was meant to serve justice, not his own ego. Melissa Chen, the law clerk who had first brought James's case to Catherine's attention, approached the judge cautiously. Judge Harmon, the first case on today's docket is ready whenever you are. Harmon nodded, still watching James. Ms. Chen, I owe you an acknowledgement as well. You saw an injustice and took action, even though it might have put your position at risk. That took courage. Melissa looked surprised. I just did what seemed right, Your Honor. Yes, Harmon said thoughtfully. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do. He turned to her. I'd like you to work with the new ADA coordinator on implementing our compliance program. Your perspective would be valuable. As they walked back into the courthouse, Harmon took one last look at James Wilson, now surrounded by fellow veterans, sharing stories and connections. The judge had always viewed his courtroom as his domain, where he wielded authority. Today, he'd learned that true authority came not from a gavel or a robe, but from humility and a willingness to right one's wrongs. In the sunshine of that autumn morning, something important had been restored, not just for James Wilson, but for everyone who witnessed justice working exactly as it should. 6 months had passed since that memorable day at the courthouse. Spring had arrived, bringing new life to the city and to James Wilson's garden, which was now twice its original size. The property dispute that had started everything was long resolved in James's favor. After the publicity surrounding the case, Riverside Development had quietly approached him with a generous offer. Not only would they respect his original property line, but they would donate additional land and resources to expand his community garden project. Today, James stood among rows of tomato plants, showing a group of elementary school children how to properly stake the young vines. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision as 20 pairs of wide eyes watched intently. You've got to be gentle, he explained, demonstrating with a green plant tie. You want to support the plant, not choke it. A small girl with braids raised her hand. Mr. Wilson, is it true you were in a war? James paused, considering how to answer. Yes, I was. A long time ago. And did you really go to jail? A boy asked bluntly, earning a sharp look from his teacher. Billy, that's not appropriate. It's all right, James said with a gentle smile. Yes, I did spend a day in jail. It was a mistake and it got fixed. Were you scared? Billy persisted. James looked thoughtfully at the young faces surrounding him. You know, sometimes in life things happen that aren't fair. The important part isn't what happens to you, but how you respond to it. The children nodded, though some looked like they didn't fully understand. Their teacher, Mrs. Patel, stepped forward. And that's why Mr. Wilson's garden is so special. Instead of being angry about what happened, he focused on making things better for everyone in our community. Now, who remembers what these plants need to grow strong? Sunlight. Water. Good soil. As the children called out answers, Catherine Wilson watched from the garden entrance, coffee cups in hand. She approached as the class moved to another section of the garden, handing her father one of the cups. "They adore you," she said, smiling as she watched the excited children. James sipped his coffee. "Kids are easy. They just want someone to listen to them, answer their questions honestly." "Like judges?" Catherine raised an eyebrow. James chuckled. "Speaking of which, how did the meeting go yesterday?" Since the incident, Catherine had been working with Judge Harmon on the county's new ADA compliance program, a commitment that had surprised many who expected her to want nothing to do with the judge who had wronged her father. "Better than expected," she replied. "The training program for court staff is ready to launch next month, and Judge Harmon has been different. Different how? More thoughtful, more willing to listen. He started having quarterly town halls where people can come and ask questions about how the court system works." She shook her head slightly. "I never would have believed it 6 months ago, but I think he genuinely changed after what happened." James nodded, unsurprised. Most people want to do right once they see clearly what that means. As they talked, a black SUV pulled up at the curb. A tall figure in military uniform emerged, accompanied by 2 men in suits. General Bradley had returned to the city for the official opening of the expanded garden project. "Tom," James called, waving him over. The general strode across the garden path, careful to stay on the gravel walkway between beds. "Jimmy, the place looks amazing." The 2 old soldiers embraced briefly. Then Bradley looked around at the thriving garden. "When you said you were expanding, I had no idea you meant all this." The garden now took up nearly half a block, with neatly organized sections for different vegetables and herbs. A small greenhouse stood at one end and a pavilion with picnic tables at the other. A hand-painted sign announced, "Wilson Community Garden, growing food, growing community." The developer donated the extra land and materials, James explained. Said it was good public relations after everything that happened, and the mayor declared it a community landmark, Catherine added. "It can never be developed now," Bradley grinned. "So your garden outlasted your property dispute and then some. That's justice." They walked together to the pavilion where volunteers were setting up for the day's ceremony. Folding chairs were arranged in rows and a small podium stood at the front. People were already beginning to arrive, neighbors, community members, veterans in their service caps, and a collection of officials in suits. Among them, looking somewhat out of place in the garden setting, was Judge Robert Harmon. He stood awkwardly to one side, holding a small gift bag, until he spotted James and approached hesitantly. "Sergeant Wilson," he greeted formally. "Congratulations on the garden." "It's truly impressive, Judge," James replied warmly. "Glad you could make it." "I brought something for you," Harmon said, holding out the gift bag. "A garden-warming present, I suppose you could call it." James took the bag and carefully removed the tissue paper. Inside was a beautifully crafted wooden sign. Carved into the surface were the words, "No greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends." Below the quote was a simple but elegant rendering of the Purple Heart Medal. "It's for your garden entrance," Harmon explained. "I thought, well, it seemed fitting." James ran his fingers over the carved letters, visibly moved. "Thank you. This means a lot." Catherine watched the exchange with interest. Her initial anger toward the judge had gradually transformed over months of working together. He wasn't the same man who had sent her father to jail. As more people gathered for the ceremony, Melissa Chen arrived with a group of courthouse staff. Since the incident, she'd been promoted to head the court's new ADA compliance office, a position created as part of the consent agreement. "Look at all these people," she said, joining Catherine. "Your father has built something special here." Catherine nodded. "He always has, in his own quiet way." At noon, the ceremony began. Mayor Gloria Hayes stepped to the podium first, welcoming everyone and praising the garden project for its contribution to the community. Next came a representative from the VA hospital, announcing a partnership where veterans in treatment would have the opportunity to work in the garden as part of their therapy. When it was James's turn to speak, he stood slowly, adjusted his hearing aids, and approached the microphone. The crowd fell silent. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, echoing his words from the courtroom months earlier. "But I want to thank everyone who helped make this garden grow. A garden teaches you important things: patience, nurturing, the understanding that sometimes beautiful things come from difficult circumstances. He looked out at the diverse crowd gathered before him, children from the elementary school, neighbors of various backgrounds, veterans both young and old. When I started this garden 20 years ago, it was just a way to keep busy after my wife passed. Then I started sharing the vegetables with neighbors who needed fresh food. Then those neighbors started helping with the planting and harvesting. Before I knew it, we had something that belonged to all of us. James gestured to the expanded garden around them. What happened 6 months ago was difficult. But look what grew from it: more land, more food for those who need it, new programs for veterans, and changes in our courtroom that will help people who might otherwise be overlooked. He turned slightly, acknowledging Judge Harmon with a nod. Sometimes justice works in unexpected ways. Sometimes it takes a detour before finding the right path. The crowd applauded as James returned to his seat. General Bradley rose next, surprising everyone by announcing a grant from a Veterans Foundation to fund the garden's operations for the next 5 years. As the ceremony concluded and people mingled, enjoying refreshments prepared by community volunteers, Catherine found herself standing with Judge Harmon and Melissa Chen, watching her father in his element, showing children how to pull carrots without breaking them, explaining the difference between varieties of tomatoes to interested adults, laughing with fellow veterans about long-ago times. He never wanted recognition, Catherine remarked. Even after all this publicity, he still just focused on the garden and helping people. Harmon nodded thoughtfully. Some people lead by example without ever intending to be leaders. Your father is one of those people. The best kind, Melissa added. Across the garden, James and General Bradley sat at a picnic table, 2 old soldiers enjoying a moment of quiet amid the celebration. Did you ever imagine, back in '68, that we'd be sitting here like this 50-some years later? Bradley asked. James shook his head. In that jungle? I wasn't sure we'd see the next morning, let alone half a century later. You saved a lot of lives that day. And you've done a lot of good with the life you got to keep, James replied. We all did the best we could with the time we were given. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the community move through the garden, children running between rows, elderly neighbors examining plants, young couples holding hands as they explored the pathways. You know, Bradley said finally, this garden reminds me of something my grandmother used to say. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today, James smiled. Wise woman. She'd have liked you, Bradley said. And she would have loved what you've created here. As the afternoon light began to soften, casting long shadows across the garden beds, James looked around at what had grown from a small patch of soil behind his modest house. Not just vegetables and herbs, but connections between people. Healing for veterans, learning for children, and unexpected changes in the justice system. What had begun as an injustice had transformed into something that reached far beyond one man's experience. Like the garden itself, it had put down roots, spread branches, and continued to bear fruit in ways no one could have anticipated. And James Wilson, watching it all from his bench beneath a flowering apple tree, found that to be the most satisfying harvest of all.